listening first to David read the affirmation and then Joycey read the Whispers from Eternity, it's kind of a challenging morning, isn't it? I mean, we're affirming, I look beyond the rainbow bubbles of this world about to burst. I fly above the tempting magic of this world. It's kind of a double whammy. Sometimes we try to tone it down a little bit and help people to sort of move from one stage of life to another. It's always a difficult challenge on the spiritual path to find that balance point between understanding how we should appropriately live in this world and how we should also disregard this world. And it's really just a progression on the spiritual path that we all have to go through. I was talking last night to a friend about a conversation I used to have with an older man who was, when I was younger, and he was older than me. And we had very different philosophies of life, and we liked and respected each other, but every single conversation, sooner or later, came to an impasse in which we just have to agree to stop. He was a very successful businessman. He liked money. He'd acquired a certain amount. To my mind, it seemed like a great deal. He never really felt that he struck it big the way he really wanted to, so he still had that thought that there was a lot more that he could have. And his whole point of view was, you get the external world organized in the way that you want it to be organized, you fix it up well, and then you feel good. You've had a good life. And in fact, he had, his wrinkled lines were mostly an upturned smile, so it had not failed for him. My point of view, even then, was that what really matters is your internal reality. Because really, no matter how organized you get it on the outside, that's all you're ever actually experiencing. And that is the only thing you can actually rely upon. This was a past life memory because I wasn't old enough to have any life experience yet. But I just knew that no matter how carefully you organized it, it was never quite going to come together in exactly the right way. There's that story that they tell about Yashoda, who was the mother of Krishna. And Krishna was an extremely mischievous child, and he was always interrupting her efforts to do her housework. So she decided once and for all she was going to tie him to a post so he wouldn't be able to come behind her and cause her trouble. So she got a length of string, and she took the baby Krishna, and she tied him to a post. But just before she could tie the knot, she was just a little short, just not quite enough string. So she went and she found some more string and she tied it together. Then she wrapped it all up, and still she was just this much short. And she repeated the little drama several times with her little Krishna boy just smiling at her. And finally she realized that with the things of this world you cannot bind the Lord. And she beseeched him to help her, and then all of a sudden she was able to tie the string. But this is the way we live in this world. We imagine that if we can get just enough string, if we can get just this little part fixed and this little part fixed and just this little part fixed, then we'll just bind it all up and it will just stay there. Even my friend, as positive as he was about his life, still lamented that he wasn't really, really rich. He was merely well off, but not really, really rich. There was just that few inches of string that he didn't quite have. Now, when we embrace this way of life of the inner understanding, then it gives rise to affirmations like renunciation and poems like Joycey read today, where we're affirming within ourselves that our energy could go this way, but we're going to focus it toward the divine and toward the divine first. And then we hear stories such as this, one of my favorites from the Bible, which is what we're reading here today, of this woman who was crowding in the crowds with Jesus and touched the hem of his garment. The picture that's described elsewhere in the Bible is that by this point in the mission of Jesus, which was only 3 short years, he had done so many miraculous things. He had healed people, he had appeared and disappeared. Perhaps I don't know if he'd even raised Lazarus from the dead yet, but he was a phenomenon and of great interest. And when he appeared anywhere, people wanted to get close to him, especially people who themselves needed something from him, one way or another. So in all that jostling of the crowd, this one woman touched the hem of his garment. And the moment that she touched that, not even his body, but his clothes, as it's described, a 12-year ailment was instantly healed. And it said all treatments had failed, but just that touch did it. Now, the other half of the story, which is told, is that Jesus felt it. He didn't say, I felt someone touch my robe. He said, I felt power drawn out of me. And with all those people around him, he knew that some unique connection had happened. So in the story, he demands to know who this is, and his disciples say, in this crowd of people, how could we possibly identify the one? And they were sort of trying to dismiss even his request. Come on, we have things to do, let's go on. But Jesus knew that something of enormous spiritual importance had happened, and in his life, nothing else mattered. He was there for one purpose only, and that was to bring people to God. And he realized that someone of great significance had been close to him, a disciple who had learned truly to attune herself to the divine. So finally she comes forward somewhat reluctantly and admits, yes, the moment that I came in contact, even with the clothing on your body, everything about my physical body was transformed. So you have so many dimensions of this, the power of a master, the automatic flow of the master, because it wasn't as if he looked at her and analyzed her condition and figured out how to shift it and then did something. He merely moved with his own divine attunement, which is what a self-realized master has. He's transcended. For him, it's no longer a struggle to affirm, this looks satisfying to me, but this is more deeply satisfying. This is attractive, but I know it's ephemeral. None of that was necessary for him. By lifetimes and lifetimes of disciplined effort, he had become a self-realized soul with the sufficient compassion that even though no karma of his own forced him to come back into the world, he came back only to be a clear and powerful, unmistakable, radiating channel of that consciousness which everyone in their heart of hearts is seeking. And just by moving through that crowd, but you see, she also, and this is the point of our reading today, self-effort versus grace. Somewhere long before that moment when the power of the two of them came together, she had been deeply within herself, obviously, asking this question, who am I? Where does my happiness come from? With the gifts of life that have been given to me, how am I best to use them? Why was I born? What is the purpose of my existence? And in ages past, if one had this kind of spiritual aspiration, there was always an irreconcilable conflict between anything that looked like ordinary life and spiritual life. But the times that we're living in now especially are a time when we're trying to learn that it's not about the form, it's about the consciousness with which we live within that form. This is a new age, this is a new teaching, this is a new time. What are we living for? And what we're trying to live for is we're trying to live according to that which will bring us the greatest level of joy. And this has also been the deepest misunderstanding of spiritual teaching, because the path requires concentration, because it isn't possible to do all things at the same time, because we only have so much life force, and if we dissipate it in all directions, at the end of a lifetime, we have nothing but dissipation. We have no focused accomplishment. And when we make choices, we have to make choices. One thing has to give way for another. There's simply no choice about it. We've been recently making an effort, as you all know, which we have now succeeded in doing, in buying this property, being ready to be able to buy this farm. And lots of different forces are at play here. We have the man who owned it before. We have other people who also wanted to buy it. We have farm laborers living on that land. And we also have our own aspiration, our sense from Master that this property has been brought to us and that it has a destiny that we are instruments to help fulfill. And yet the needs of all these other people and their realities, I feel them like pulling on my consciousness. And you think, well, they have needs too, and this person has needs, and they have something they want to do. And I was, for a moment, just spinning in all of that, trying to be all things to all people. And then I realized deep in myself, no, each one of us has to listen deeply to what God is asking us to do, and sometimes have the courage just to stand strong to our own mission and realize that everybody's soul has its own journey. And it doesn't serve God more to not answer deeply the call that comes to you. Swami Kriyananda has been sarcastic to me, was sarcastic to me only twice in my life. I'll tell you the first one first, which is not relevant to the story, and then I'll tell you the second. I used to be very careless about my appearance, and I thought that was an act of renunciation. Swami thought it was an act of complete disregard for the fact that everyone else had to look at me. So this came to a head of all things when this was long before I was married to David. This was when I was still in the monastery, and we were actually on a trip to Carmel. And Swami decided it was the day that he was going to talk to me about this. And I recall I pulled on this brown batik skirt and this big schlumpy brown sweater, and he looked at me and said, "Did you bring anything better than that?" I said, "No, sir, this is all I have." And he looked at the rest of the group and he said, "Well, we're just going to have to buy her a new dress, aren't we?" I mean, nobody had any money, and we're in Carmel, which is not like an inexpensive place to shop. He drags us all to this store. This all really happened. He goes through the racks. I'm standing there like this. He goes through the racks, and he pulls out this white shirtwaist dress. It was a kind of an eyelet, just, very simple white dress. I mean, at the time, it looked to me like something that Princess Diana would wear, even though she probably wasn't even born at that point. I was so intimidated by it. And so he had me try it on, He liked the way it looked. It cost like about $100. He solicited the money from everyone around me to pay for this dress. It was thin enough that you could see my underwear, and I didn't have a slip. And I'm a nun, right? And I sort of said, "Sir, it's a little transparent." And he looks at everyone, he says, "Pretend it's her bathing suit." And then the whole weekend I had to wear the dress. I was over the top. It broke something in me that needed to be broken and opened up something that needed to be opened, but what a trial. So this is the first time he was sarcastic. So we're heading back to the village, and I said to him, "Sir, do I have to wear this after we go home?" Like that. He said, "No." He said, "Well, put it in a glass case and make it part of the tour when guests come." I never wore it again. And somehow, interestingly, when I moved from the Ananda village to here, by then I was married and so on, I had it in a box with this beautiful blue sweater that Swamiji had also given me on another occasion, which I loved, of course, and I lost that box. I always thought Divine Mother just kind of said, "You never really took that one in the right way," so both of them were taken from me. The second time he was sarcastic, and now we're going to get back on the point. The second time was when when they started the San Francisco Center for Ananda. I volunteered to be part of that. I would actually say I imposed myself on that project when it wasn't really my karma to be there. And I was restless at Ananda Village, and I just wanted to do something else, so I imposed myself on that project. But I really wasn't part of the team, so Swami was too kind to reject me, but he also had to keep me out of the project, really, because I wasn't supposed to be there karmically. So as a result, he was going back and forth to Ananda Village a lot, and every time he would leave, he would take me with him, because he needed to get me out of San Francisco. So one particular woman felt exiled in San Francisco, and so she said something to me that was the equivalent of, "It's not fair We have to stay in the city and you don't have to stay in the city. So I felt really bad about that. And so I said to Swamiji, well, maybe I should, stay here this weekend. I hadn't figured out all the rest of it at that point. I hadn't figured out that I didn't belong there yet. And he said to me, what are you going to do? He said, just sit here all weekend and hold her hand, like that. That was the second time he was sarcastic, ever. But he got my attention, meaning there's a difference between divine guidance and sentiment. And there's a difference between divine guidance and guilt. And there's a difference between divine guidance and accepting it or being afraid and then justifying your fear with all these other attitudes. When Dr. Lewis first met Master, and Dr. Lewis was Master's first disciple in Boston. They met on Christmas Eve. Master sat him down, touched him at the spiritual eye, and the whole cosmos opened in front of him. So Dr. Lewis had had a pretty strong experience, and from that point on, he was Master's disciple. But he had been very active in the Rosicrucians at that point. And I believe it was the Rosicrucians. I think he was president of the society and had many duties. And so now, with this relationship to Master, he said, what should I do? I have all this world going on here. And Master's answer was very important. He said, you mustn't be ruled by sentiment. That was how he put it. You could hardly think it was a bad thing he was involved in, but it was also clear that God was calling him to a different destiny. And sometimes in our lives, you see, we just have to have the courage even to let go. Let go of realities that in and of themselves may have been beautifully important to us, may still have qualities that are very attractive to us, but if we ever hope to reach the end of the journey, the true end of the journey, which is freedom from all of these compulsions, we have to make choices. And often those choices are very hard. Sometimes those choices very clearly break your heart. But the only reason they break your heart is so that it will break open and so that more can come. You cannot follow that path unless you feel it from inside that that's what you're supposed to do. There was a certain point in my life when I had one experience where I felt called to a certain action, and that certain action had consequences, unhappy consequences for others. And I had to simply hold to the feeling that I had. And even though the unhappy consequences were tugging at me, just like gripping at the bottom of my skirt, they didn't have the same divine quality that the call had. And every great person in life, whatever field of accomplishment it might be, there's a story about a famous violinist I don't remember his name, but he gave an extraordinary concert, and afterward a fan came up to him and said, I'd give my life to be able to play that violin like you do. And the musician said, just like this, I have. You wished for it, but I did it. So we wish for that grace of God to come to us. We're always asking to be rescued, always. Always some part of us. It's the difference between praying to be healed, to being prayed to face the karma that makes us unwell is quite different than asking to be rescued from that karma. We're often asking to be rescued from the dilemma of our life. We couch that as a prayer, but seldom do we say, whatever it is that I'm supposed to learn, bring it to me now. Give me the strength to face it. Whatever sacrifice you ask of me is not too much for this that I'm going to achieve. But somewhere in the course of our lifetimes, that those hard choices have to be made. Nothing great is ever accomplished without tapasya. Tapasya is the focusing of our energy, the magnetizing from a higher source, that power of God. It's very easy to point to circumstances which prevent things from happening, because circumstances often prevent things from happening. But what drew to us those circumstances? In the story in the Bible, this poor woman bled for 12 years. She had a hemorrhage for 12 years. But clearly, somehow, during that time, Whatever else was pulling on her, she was always pulling her consciousness back to the divine. Just always pulling it back to the divine. And it's not something that happens in a minute. It happens every minute, and then again, 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 and then again and again and again. You know, but at the end of it, it's always now. And if we have stored up all those moments, then we stand where we want to stand. And if we're not standing where we want to stand, then we have to try again and have to try again. How could this be happening outside the will of God? All failure, Swamiji said, is the result of lack of attunement to that divine flow. That's not, this horrible condemnation of any kind. It just means, well, somehow I just didn't find where that ray was flowing. All unhappiness is for lack of attunement to the divine will. Now, that doesn't mean that tragedy doesn't swirl around us, because karma has its way. Some of us are blessed to have a smooth flowing life, and some of us just fall into pit after pit after pit after pit, and then we just have to pull ourselves up and pull ourselves up. But if we continue in that effort, then just the hem of the divine touches us, and suddenly everything goes in a new direction. It's not an effortless life. But in the end, it's so profoundly victorious. It's just, you can't imagine any other way of being. And it comes deep in your heart. And then if you're running a business in town, if you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, if you're raising children, if you're a teacher, whatever it is, all of it suddenly assumes this completely different quality. It all becomes this relationship with the divine, this balance that Master is talking about here, that Jesus is talking about, between the effort we make to be in tune and then the effortless flow that comes with that attunement. We've just gone through this project of raising a lot of money to buy this property, and it's been truly a miracle, the amount of money that we've raised, how fast we've raised it, how smoothly it's gone. But that success at this point, and I say it with great appreciation and praise of every hero in this room who's been part of this. That's been the fruit of years and years and years and years of collective disciplined effort on our part. Working together individually and as a community. And all of you who come in new, your karma brings you at the right moment and the right time. That we've all, time after time, through hard and easy times, through deep celebrations, through individual trials, we've helped one another and we've worked individually to bring our consciousness back. And so then when challenge comes, whether it's the challenge to accomplish, the challenge to overcome, oh, I remember how to work with this. I scorn the tempting bubbles of this world ready to burst. And even though I've been cherishing those tempting bubbles, petting them, hoping they wouldn't burst, when they do burst, now I know what to do. I just bring my consciousness back to the center. And then the Bhagavad Gita promises, I love this verse, for those who give themselves wholeheartedly to me, I make up for their deficiencies. Don't you just love that? Oh, well, this one is a little lumpy in this place. We'll just smooth her out a little bit. Somebody will come. Somebody will come. In Ananda village, there is the story of the building of the double curved roof of what is now Hansa Temple, and how the men were trying to build that, and Swami had designed it just with a little picture. And this was before we had to have anything engineered or anything like that. He just designed this double curve. And they were just young men, even learning to build, and they just could not figure out how to build that double curve, and they did every other thing they could do on the building without knowing how to do that, and they were literally packing up their tools and walking off the job when a man who had never been to Ananda village before pulls up in his truck. Hi, he said, I'm from Santa Barbara. I just left home this morning. I felt I should be here. What's going on this site? Well, here's this double curved roof we're trying to build. Oh, he said, I'm probably the only man in California who knows how to build a double curved roof. And then he stayed with us and he taught the men how to build that roof, which is still standing. And how do you plan that? How do you write that in your business model, your 5-year business plan? At this point, at year 3.5, Darnell Bond was his name, will feel inspired in Santa Barbara to drive up and arrive just in time before they walk off, before the men walk off. But just in that moment, just so it's really perfectly dramatic. When we were trying to acquire the community here, which was bought by a group of investors, you know, in real estate, you go forward for a long time and all you're spending is time, but at a certain point you start risking money. So we had collected a certain amount of money and we had reached the point where we had to, if we went forward, we had to pledge $100,000, and if we failed to acquire all the rest of the money, that $100,000 was gone. A lot of money, and it wasn't ours. We didn't have all the money, and we had no source of all the money. And there was about 6 of us working on that committee, and we had a whiteboard. Then we kept writing the numbers. Then we'd erase them and write them in a different color pen, and then we'd write them in a different system. But no matter how we wrote them, they never added up. They were several $100,000 short. We were at the end. Finally, though, there was another feeling in the room. And the feeling in the room is, you're doing the right thing. And so many of us, some of us have had LASIK surgery, so we don't wear glasses, but many of us wore glasses. So we had this idea. We stepped back a little farther. We took off our glasses. Gee, it seems to add up just fine now. And then we turned to one another. This was the famous moment. We turned to one another and says, well, if we go down, we all go down together. We put our hands together like the sports teams do. And the phrase we use in the fire ceremony, Om Swaha, I cast myself into the infinite. We did this big, like a football cheer, Om Swaha. We said like that. We walked out, we signed the papers. 3 or 4 days later, a man we hardly knew, who just came and sat in the church like this, he walked up to the woman who was in charge. He said, I have 3 properties in San Jose. Why don't I just sell them and put them into this one? Exactly the money that we needed. You can't write that into the business plan. But if you really want to succeed in the way that counts above all, so that when the final exam comes, your heart is where you want your heart to be. But even in this world, I make up for your deficiencies, and I make permanent your gains. The only permanent gain is divine bliss. But isn't that the one we want to have? Isn't that the one that the only one that matters? Enjoy the tempting magic of this world with its rainbow bubbles getting ready to burst. They're beautiful while they float. But give your heart only to God.